afternoon, Brian.
How are you doing, sir?
I'm doing pretty well, thank you. Still a touch under the weather, but not bad. So it's just a little annoying, but I'm okay.
Yeah, cool.
How are you doing?
I'm doing good. The sun is out. It's still a little chilly, but we're moving in the right direction.
Yeah.
And I got a little more sleep than has been the rule the past few days. And
The dire wolves were not keeping you up at night.
well, they did a little post parvo bout with loose stools in the middle of the night for a couple nights, and that's enough to put me off my game.
Yeah.
But they're definitely, the learning curve, you can see them negotiating the learning curve. They're not just growing in size, but they're actually growing into little dog people, so it's fascinating to watch, actually. I've never watched 3 litter mates side by side go through that individuation. Intellectually it happens, but I've just never had the opportunity to be all up in its business quite that close to watch it, and, it's interesting.
Yeah, individuation is never something I thought dogs do much of, so that is interesting.
Well, and it really has shined some light on conversations that we've had about the part and the whole, and the for dogs really have a sense of us, and, that like a pack animal, logically, we would think that, but there is something to be learned maybe from that degree of usness and the way they operate, and the way they don't seem to hold grudges, at least with each other, which is an interesting kind of thing. It's like babies, one emotion passes and the next emotion, and there doesn't seem to be much residue. But it's interesting because there has been this, I think the topic has been, how do we drop the microscope down on relationships? And so it's like, I think the other thing was this question of what we've called the hard problem of consciousness. What is it like to be a one of these or one of those? And the famous conversation was in a paper that was written by a modern philosopher, I think it's Chalmers, was what is it like to be a bat? And in there, he was kind of trying to stress how far from the human experience the bat consciousness has to be, being so focused on darkness and echolocation and all that. It's like, yeah, that tells us something, but looking at it, at the relationship of the consciousness of an animal that we have had this long ongoing co-development with. It's like it hasn't just been, I mean, we've had a long relationship with cats, but somehow we don't get the feeling that we've co-developed quite the same way that we have with dogs.
You
It's
think you think having had such a long relationship with dogs has changed people significantly?
Oh, I think there's no doubt. I
Like
think there's
how?
no doubt. That's a good question. I mean, there's probably different places to drop that. It probably has to do with the whole story of dogs, because there's probably two distinct threads there, to my way of thinking. There's the dogs that we had a relationship with in the interest of mutual survival. And these were like the ones that came into the firelight to get the scraps, is the story that we're always told. And so they realized, hey, there's a niche here. If we can learn how to work these two-legged things, then they'll, pretty soon we'll have them making beds just for us if we work it right. you know, and sure enough, you know, uh, and then
Oh,
there's
I think that was very much a cat-thropic interpretation. I think what happened is much more likely, these taller creatures must be dominant, so, we're open to listening to what they have to say.
yeah, or maybe puppies got taken because they're so good at running away. And, so there had to be they had to lose the option of running away
But
somehow, yeah.
but hierarchy is so important in dog world, and that's the machine that people slot into so easily.
Absolutely.
That doesn't exist in cat world. So I
Right,
don't think but
right.
cats are getting us to make their beds for sure. Dogs, I don't think so. I think dogs will sleep wherever we tell them because we slot into that hierarchical structure,
And they ideally would prefer to sleep right up against you.
but probably below your waist,
Well, that's
again,
interesting, yeah,
because of that
yeah.
hierarchical structure.
Yeah. Well, and I think it's that puppy thing maybe for the warmth and the security, of the bigger animal. I remember when I was a kid, they said, if your puppy is whining, then you put an alarm clock under a pillow, and the ticking will imitate the heartbeat of the mother dog, and then the dog won't be it seems totally, like, Skinnerian, right? And it's like, there's no way you're fooling these puppies. And these puppies, this mostly the one, the really when they were young, they wanted to get as close to your heart as they could. There definitely was a thing there. And maybe it's also the center of warmth. It was really cold. So it's like, here's the big creatures. It seems pretty instinctive. But that sense of us and how that's wired into their psychology, and we have a similar wiring in the usness. It's just much more complicated or complex. It's maybe better. Yeah, so anyway, I thought it was sort of interesting. It did have me pondering that the psychological aspects of relationship to the group, and the so-called mass psychology. And we've talked, I think, a little bit about how that pokes its head up in a bunch of different ways. Certainly pokes its head up in ethics. Obviously, pokes its head up in politics.
So it's interesting. I've been doing more coaching work lately, and one thing that's struck me is sort of the transience of so many of the us contexts that people exist in compared to how I imagine that was in the past. Even people having jobs in the not too distant past, could be like a 40 or 50-year thing, for better
Before
or
the
for
before
worse.
the gig economy. Yeah.
And and then nuclear family and extended family and community and people remaining in one location for generations, and even in the last 100 years, the transience that people have experienced, especially in the United States, has dramatically increased, let alone,
Sure.
1,000 years
Absolutely.
ago.
Right. Well,
Um,
and you're backing into E.F.'s Schumacher here, and "The Small is Beautiful." There being a corporate agenda to make people transient so as to refocus their loyalties. So
yeah,
that
I
was
mean, that's a
definitely a
little
chapter.
conspiratorial in that, no organization that I've been responsible for wanted loyalty to the organization above family, and nor tried to create instability. So yeah, maybe there's an
Mhm.
agenda, but what's more interesting to me is, what do we do about the extent to which the transience of usness has pervaded culture, and what are the impacts of that? Is there anything we can do about it?
Yeah.
Um,
I think the impacts are loyalties. I do, because I grew up as the son of someone who worked for IBM. So I was moved. That's what they used to joke. It says IBM stands for I've been moved. And there was a corporate agenda that said every 3 years. And it wasn't a war against the family, it was a war against the community. And it wasn't really a direct war against it. It was more like slipping this new community in between the family and the old community, which was regionally based. But if you had a culture that wasn't regional because it's corporate, so you can get transferred from Milwaukee to Anchorage to Miami, and you've got the same culture, the same languaging, and the same extracurricular clubs, which was a thing also because it was part of the agenda. You don't want to have friends in the community that you spend your recreation time with. You want to spend your recreation time with other people in the business. And that way, your loyalty to the business increases because if you part ways with the company, you're parting ways with all those friends too. And I mean, you could maybe it's conspiratorial, or maybe it's just using the natural dynamics that spring up because there's not all those dynamics help the corporation. For example, people carry a lot of behaviors from high school into corporations because of the largeness and maybe the non-specificity of it. I remember seeing this in the hospital. And so you get cliques, you get, the corporate equivalent of mean girl clubs, you get, and then, we want to say we live in a democracy, but all those dynamics within a corporation, they all kind of can push against a democratic sort of an environment. It can get extremely hierarchical, in other words, in groups and out groups. The people that crack the whip and the people that have to jump, or the people in favor and don't have to work as hard, and the people that are always kind of worried about whether their space is safe or not. And so and I think all these are probably expansions and translations of family dynamics. Where you've got authority structures represented by the parents or the management or this all extension of that.
I've definitely had the experience of, at first unwittingly and later being more aware of family dynamics being projected onto me when I was in a position of authority in an organization. Like unequivocally, that's what was happening. I got
Mhm.
treated like somebody's father, and many, many more than one time.
As a kung fu teacher, that was the same for me often.
Yeah, I'm
Yeah.
sure, and it may probably even more so because of the physical component of that.
Yep. And that listening develops your speaking.
Hmm.
Like, there is a sense in which we w I is l I suppose it isn't just it necessarily positive, but one hopes that it's positive, that listening calls forth the speaking for which it is a listening, which is, from our higher self and our rather
Yeah,
than from our lower self,
and, and not speaking as though we are taking on the role of father, but rather speaking with the understanding that that's being projected onto us, and we're responsible for what pebbles we toss into that water.
One would hope. One would
Yeah,
hope. Yeah.
it is complex.
And you can't entirely be responsible for it because a lot of people's neuroses are centered around parental relationships, and so if you're stepping into it, in the psychotherapist business, we call that projection.
Yeah, but what pebbles you toss, you can be responsible for. What ripples
Oh, you
result
should be. You
is
you
another thing.
absolutely have to be because, particularly because other things are coming in. If you start throwing things indiscriminately, it makes the situation infinitely, almost non-interpretable. Right.
Yeah.
It's like you're making too much noise to hear the music. So there does have to be a certain appropriateness that gets translated, hopefully, when anytime somebody's in a position of influence. And that's what with the martial arts thing, I would see this process as people come and they basically, when they tie on a white belt, they give you all their power. And then you give it back to them in a conscious way that hopefully brings a lot of things in with it. So by the time somebody's a black belt, they're not quite the same person because there's something extra has been added there. And hopefully part of that is a dose of morality, has traditionally been part of the package. But no, and this is also that question of how much of morality is related to our identity and our sense of self. And there's a lot of questions that we've been stirring the pot on as to where these things are sourced from or grounded, is the way they usually put it.
I think I want to come back to that, but I'm not done with this transience problem.
Mhm. Yeah.
Because I'm thinking about, people are all of these dynamics that people need to work out with their families. They end up working out at work for
Oh, yeah,
or
yeah.
not, right? But they try. And I'm thinking about whether men and women might be impacted differently by that. Because I'm thinking about, this crisis of men that we hear about, and suicide rates, and um, uh, you know not going to college may or may not be crisis. I'm not sure, but certainly a lot of men are stuck developmentally, and
Yeah.
and I wonder how much this transience has to do with it. And when you were talking about the martial arts relationship, there's kind of like a surrogacy for fatherhood that's being transmitted there. through a tradition, which is really interesting. And I wonder if there's something our organizations could learn from that.
Well, yeah, and I wonder again, there used to be the idea that a business was like a family, and
Yeah.
it used to be like, you had a founder, and the founder was there sitting at the head like King Arthur on the round table at the head of the board of directors with continuity, and often his name was on the thing, right? And then maybe his son took over, like with Ford Motor or something like that, and there was this idea that there was longevity here because there was a constancy, and there was an implication that this person was somehow dependable and worthy of loyalty. But then we kind of got in a culture now where it's more like professional sports, where you get a pitcher and you have him for a while, but he's got a career that's limited, and so you're going to have him for the 3 years when you think his arm is the best, and then you're going to do a trade for the new guy that's got. And so if we do that with our team leaders, and if our and or if we do that with our principals, maybe maybe it's our principal ALS and LES, both that is the principals of the company who should be sourcing the identity and the vision and the as well as the ethics, right, and the internal relationship ideas. But when those things become transient, then it's you can expect that down the chain, right? So you're going to have employees that are looking for their next job most of the time. And at least psychologically, there maybe is a little bit of a difference in the engagement and in the and I think that again, coming back to Schumacher, he talks about, these companies, this shoe company, and I think the idea was it only grows to so big of a size, maybe 300 employees, and then it spurs off another company. So that it's a setting in which the people really who make it up do participate in some degree. And I think there's probably a whole topic about participation, whether we talked with Paul about participation in democracy, and the we're working on our next guest, which is going to be related to literacy, and one of the things that comes out of that is the impact on literacy and people's ability to participate. And we talked about ethics and how the ethics shouldn't be only up in the C-suite, but the ethics have to be all the way down at each person. The guy holding the sword has to make the ethical judgments about where to swing it. So yeah, there's definitely a theme kind of going on there.
Do you see this? Is it so? So I'm thinking of another word for transience. Really, could be fragmentation in the David Bohm sense. This is like the physical or semi-physical manifestation of the fragmentation of our thinking. Right, thinking
Mhm.
the way we think divides everything into fragments, and here we are manifesting a reality in which our families and our communities and our lives in so many ways are fragmented.
Yep.
What comes up for you around how that kind of dynamic, like what, how would the I Ching describe that dynamic, and what would resolution look like? I'm looking for like,
To the
what's the
transience, to
essence?
the fragmentation.
What's the essence of that dynamic?
The thing that bubbled up to me was Wendell Berry in relationship to place. And like I say, I was moved every 3 years. And so when it was up to me, and when I was looking at planning my life, I plopped down in a place, and I've been here now 38 years because I so integrated the impact of that transience. This is a relationship also. I just flashed on Alan Watts talking about the lower class, the middle class, and the upper class. And the upper class lives in the past because that's where their glory was. But the middle class lives in the future. And part of that living in the future, that's why he calls them the biggest suckers of all three. the middle class, because their payout is always in the future and they somehow don't grasp that the future never comes. And so it seems to me that once you lose attachment to place and you're kind of drifting, well, where does your security come from if it doesn't come from attachment to your place? It comes from more conceptual things. Well, I've got a good job, I've got a good reputation, I've got a lot of capital, and I can move that around. And but there's something that's not grounding about that. And so when we talk about fragmentation and you talk about dynamic, I immediately translate energetic, not just a concept, but an energetic. And that's why how I get to place so easily. The living a life where you care about the place because the place and your life are intermingled. And that's why I'm always urging people to be in a place that's got as much nature as your lifestyle can possibly tolerate because of the energetic of that, the grounding of that, the reality, the here and nowness of that. In Alan Watts' three things, from a Zen perspective, it's the common person, the peasant, who really wins because they live in the now, and they live in the now because that's all they've got. Well, when you're in nature, you're in the now. Nature only lives in the now. And so if you are immersed in that, even if you're projected and remembered, and even if all of that still lives within your head as you bring it around, when that's the dumpling in a soup of now, you're better off than if that's the only thing on your plate, if that makes sense. Because there is an energetic to it, and there's also, I mean, maybe it is conspiratorial, but I think that there's a security when you're plugged in to a place, and that a corporation may well benefit from people having the type of insecurity that comes from being displaced, as well as maybe governmental, you know, that there's some advantage there. Certainly, if you're in a transient mindset, you don't really care about the environment that much. And when I look across America, as hitchhike across it as I have, there's a great TED talk about it by an architect on the topic of how have we managed to generate so many places that nobody cares about. Now, as a hitchhiker, I was spending a lot of my time on highway sidings and going through, industrial sections and all that. But that's a thing that goes on here. People relate to place in ways without care, and they generate places that no one cares about. Just
I
look at
do think
architecture in a lot of sections of towns. It's like, really? Really? You phoned that in, you know?
I think yeah, I was thinking of projects, exactly. And, here in Philadelphia, projects have mostly been torn down and replaced with more or less normal looking subsidized housing, and I
Mhm.
think the city's better for it. But I'm also thinking of, whole cities that have been abandoned because of their relationship with corporate interests like Detroit or,
Rust Belt, the whole Rust Belt.
Rust Belt, yeah. And like I think I'm sure there are companies that had very specific agendas about how they were going to manipulate people's relationship with family and community
Particularly in the '50s and '60s.
in order to engender certain performance. And I also think it's very possible, this being a complex system, the human relationship with family and community and place, to try to do something with good intentions. Like, you were talking about clubs. If I were, if in order for my business to work, I needed to move people around because I needed expertise to go where it was needed most, and I wanted people to feel comfortable with that. I would consider creating clubs too, so that when they landed in a new place, they would feel connected instead of
Absolutely.
isolated. So,
Right,
I could see that,
right.
also being an unintended
Sure,
consequence of
right.
relatively altruistic.
Does that club help them fuse with the community? Is that club a bridge to the local community or a replacement for it?
Right, right, and
Yeah,
maybe that was a question that was never asked. Yeah.
right, right.
So, I'm really glad that that this concept of place has come up, and the way it came up was kind of like pulling a tarot card, you know?
Yep, yep,
Like, "Oh, this is about place," and I'm
right.
wondering in the strategy deck or going back to Wendell Berry, I have the sense there's more to be said about
Yeah.
place.
Well, one of the thing that I thought about with Wendell in place was because he's a farmer and he raised sheep. And he talks about how you don't just get a generic sheep and put it on a generic piece of land, because there is no generic sheep and there is no generic piece of land. So what that means is you've got to get the right sheep for that piece of land. And that requires a kind of a knowledge that's inherited knowledge, really. And he says there's one part on his farm, and I can relate to this, from my property. There's one place on the farm where he maybe I can't remember whether he had the wrong sheep, and so a section got overgrazed, and then erosion started, and he said that he could never quite fix that mistake, and that every time he walked by that, he kind of winced because it was his lack of knowledge of learning about the land to be able to really belong to that land. So again, this talks about a process that he has to go through, an authentic process or an authenticating process where he's got learning curve, and if folks remember our conversation about the hermeneutics and us having this picture of the whole, and then every new day in our life, every new piece of the puzzle is related. We understand it in terms of the whole that we've been building. Well, understanding place and the learning that needs to happen to inhabit a place that happens over decades. It doesn't happen overnight or over a season or two. That dimensionalizes itself in our grasp of things and how things work. To know how bees work, to know how plants work, to know how water runs on the land, to know how different years are different and how the plants and the animals react to the differences in not only the weather and the season of the year, but also to each other's and the varying population flows between the species. This is complex. It's not complicated. It's complex, and we can't possibly be a partner to all this without a learning curve and without us changing a bit energetically. I really have an affinity for the old Taoist idea that the organs of our body are related to our environment and to the seasons and to the planets, and like the your body is a vessel that rides the environment like a boat in a river, right? Well, those five organs are also the foundation of our consciousness. So so how your boat is working in the river has a lot to do with how your consciousness is riding in that boat. And how you steer that boat is whether it's going to get you to that good life, that eudaimonia that Aristotle talked about, right? Or that fulfillment of your potential.
So I'm thinking about a conversation we've had a few times about kind of any political system works if the people are virtuous and doesn't if the people aren't virtuous. And the kind of lack of incentive that there is, at least in the United States, for the kind of relationship to place that you're describing because of the requirement for this kind of long horizon, authentic unfolding of a relationship so that
Right.
choices really are curated with this really long term in mind. And so I'm wondering, like, can a return to place only result from the internal development of a million or a billion individuals? Or is there some collective mechanism here that could facilitate or incentivize revisioning a relationship with place?
Yeah. Well, I think that things are always in a situation of redefining themselves because we're in this world of becoming. And so, this we've talked about before about self-organizing systems and how they move in and out of states of criticality. And when we see that a certain paradigm stops working, maybe we really have to get our nose wiped in it. Maybe we have to get wise to people who are benefiting from it, even though our collective interest is in evolving past it, whatever the particular it may be. But that eventually it seems like it can't be opposed, when this is what one of the most difficult books on philosophy in the Western world, it's pretty widely acknowledged, is written about, and this is Hegel's phenomenology of spirit. And it's this idea that the spirit of mankind, not of any one individual, but of the race in general, is unfolding a story that's moving towards a point, that's going somewhere, that has meaning. This is a teleological metaphysics, right? This is a telos is the end or the goal. This idea that there is a point to things. There is an oak tree that an acorn is pointing at. There is a grand entelechy in the world that's trying to open to a certain place or condition or a directionality, that we're not just going in circles, that we're spiraling somewhere, say. And that's definitely a fundamental metaphysical assumption, and how you arrive at that is personal, I guess. But
And the other thing to bring in here is I'm realizing dragon and tiger because as I've been thinking about my next chapter, and what role tiger might have in it. One of the things that comes up a lot is working with my hands, but now I'm realizing how important it is that the relationship with place be the context for that. So like there's a way that woodworking checks that box, and there's another way that growing food does.
Mhm, mhm,
Um, so yeah, that's interesting to think about the tiger dragon piece.
yeah. And the idea that you're not in a place, but if you're inhabiting a place, that place is a curriculum. And if you're not paying attention to that and trying to actually unfold yourself to it, taking advantage of it, as in fulfilling what it is to be a human in the ways that only humans can be, then you're like the guy sitting in the orchestra with an amazing piece of music being played for you, and you're kind of going blah 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 with your ears covered so you can't hear it, because of only your own inner confusion and fragmentation, and that your inner condition. So this idea that Lao Tzu had is that if you take muddy water and you let it set a while, it will the mud will precipitate out. Eventually you'll get clearer and clearer water. And so, like, that's an environmental thing, right? Because what's necessary? The cup can't get joggled all the time. Cup gets joggled all the time, you're just going to have chocolate looking water the whole time. It has to be on a table, it's not moving. In other words, right? So environment is huge. It's huge, and more environment is becoming a privilege. So that's why I went into the desert, because the Hopi have this idea that they chose the blue corn because it was the smallest, and that nobody would ever fight them for it because it had so little value in the world of men. This is at least what I've been told. And that they took the land that was the desert land, that wasn't lush, and it wasn't the best farmland, and it wasn't because then they knew that people would never fight them for it. They didn't know about uranium underneath in those days, unfortunately. But also I think there was this idea that, and I don't hope I'm not putting words in their mouth, but I'm going to use it as an excuse for the idea that when we come into a close relationship with land, in a natural state, that and live close to it. I don't mean just visit on weekends in glamping. Is that what they call it? I don't mean glamping. I mean being out there. Like, if you're not having flashbacks of your relatives back in the day when this was the reality, then you probably are still too close to glamping. right? And I particularly think this is a good experience for a kid, just to sort of set their parameters of things, so you appreciate running water and, you know, but, but that actually does something to us in our development, like when I was a kid, I was cold and I was wet, and I had to carry a pack times when I wished I could have sat down and, but it was all about that. That was the environment, that was the setting, and I think that if you're grounded in that, it can give you a leg up as far as having some spiritual savvy and having a little bit of sand in your gut, and that nature makes us in some respect, and that we're better off for it, and that we don't wanna get too far away from that. And so that is part of that, and if we're really grounded in that, then we couldn't do to places what we do to places. We would have to think about it differently, It's like, look around places in Albuquerque. Like, elves in The Lord of the Ring would never build such a thing, right? Because they're too close to nature, and they know that this is just contrary to all the force of life, the way this has gone about, right? And so there really needs to be a fundamental revisioning of who we are and what is the space that we inhabit and what's our role, That's really the role not only of ethics, but of philosophy, and that is how should we live,
Makes
you
me
know?
wonder if collectively we're all having this Wendell Berry experience of walking past the piece of land on which we grazed the wrong sheep, and there's no way of fixing it. Which is not to say that there aren't plenty of other parts of the land, metaphorically, where I think we can do fine. But there are, like rebuilding our cities in a way that takes into account our relationship with nature is
Absolutely.
probably unachievable, right? These cities are built up, and the infrastructure is hundreds of is 100 plus years old in many cases,
In many cases.
and rebuilding it is a huge undertaking. But
We
I'm
we
curious.
need to rebuild ourselves first, and when we rebuild ourselves, then our settings will just find themselves to be rebuilt.
Well, that's kind of where I was going. With is I keep thinking of this as an unfolding from the internal to the external, right? That as awareness changes or self-awareness changes, choices change too. And there's a collective element to that. So culture changes too, not just individual
Absolutely,
choice.
absolutely. And we're
Um,
seeing that happen. Just that the internet makes so much more information accessible helps us come to one mind, even though it doesn't seem like that. Even though there's a lot of cacophony around it, you don't just snap to a global Weltanschauung. You have to kind of arrive at it. And a lot of what's going on now is mirror like, right? Seeing your past behavior in that hillside erosion and realizing that this is a problem that you manifested through insufficient development, let's say. And so we don't always like to look in the mirror. And we have to maybe grow to that. But that's what the internet is, isn't it? One big mirror.
eh,
And we can
or
use it to be,
hologram, yeah.
yeah. And we can use it to really inform ourselves, or we can use it to kind of, get really spun, or really narcissistic, maybe.
Yeah. Yeah, mirrors will do that too,
Yeah.
right?
Veiled Snow White reference there.
Yeah. So I wanted to go back to the Hopi since you mentioned them, and I'm thinking about there. Is it in the Hopi prophecy, the planting stick path and the zigzag path, and I don't remember how those pieces fit together,
On the prophecy stone, yeah.
but I'm guessing that this speaks to kind of what we're talking about.
Yeah, and I know that on YouTube, there are places where Hopi, elder people have explained the interpretation of the prophecy stone. And so there is a way to get a pretty detailed unfolding of that if you want to pursue that. But yeah, basically it talks about a fork in the road, that one way is the planning stick path and one way is the zigzag path. And there's a crossover point. And that crossover point means that you can be born on the planning stick path and cross over to the zigzag path. Or you can be born to the zigzag path and cross over to the planning stick path. But that a time in history will come where that bridge between the two paths is passed, and you'll kind of be stuck where you choose. That's the interpretation
What
of
do
it.
you think the zigzag path represents? I guess I'm assuming the planting stick path represents an agrarian life, but obviously
Yeah,
I'm projecting.
yeah, yeah. In listening to the natural dictates regarding human life and our place in the world. And I think that in there also is reference to a couple of the ash gourds of ashes. I think is how it gets interpreted as the dropping of the atom bombs. And so that pretty well, I think, represents the zigzag path. The zigzag path just sort of goes off, and it's not straight and level. It just goes off. Shh, you know, and
Uh-huh.
so I think that a lot of our we talked about fragmentation, right? It talked about the battle for attention. Um, and I think a lot of those things are components of the zigzag path.
Yeah, seems like when you made the gesture of the zigzag path kind of just going off, I immediately thought again of fragmentation.
Yeah, yeah,
And the prophecy says there is a point of no turning back.
mhm, yeah,
Yeah. Yeah.
yeah. Seems like. And the Hopi world has this idea that we've this is not the first world, nor is it the last world, and that we go through a process to pass from the one to the other. And so there's a lot of interesting stuff now. I mean, say what you will about the internet, but there's a lot of stuff that's accessible that was not accessible like just not that long ago. And some of that has been some Native Americans. I think Wally Brown, also from the Navajo, uh, he's got a Navajo teachings channel, which we'll put in the show notes, where he talks about the traditional teachings and the interpretation of how humans should live from a traditional viewpoint. And one of the things that I think that represents that we even represent in the story of Eastern Western philosophy becoming global philosophy, addressing the lack of meaning in the post nuclear world, that Native American worldviews and spirituality do play a role, and that they do bring some of these root understandings of things sort of back to relevance to us. And that I know that you and I have both been, worldview impacted by Native American traditions, and not in I mean, you can see me. I don't wear feathers. I don't. This is not a dress up for my personality thing. This isn't. And I think we've talked about, and no doubt we shall more about. This is something of metaphysical impact. This is something that charts new places in your semantic world, which means that it's part of that hermeneutic base that helps you understand yourself and your place in everything else. So philosophically, it's of pretty significance. It's not about dressing up with feathers. It's about this immersion with our metaphysical state in a less dressed up form that makes certain things more obvious.
Mm.
And it
Yeah.
also brings the personality of nature. When we hit this point philosophically where everything's just dead matter, and it's all just when it looks like something that's not just dead matter happening, that's just a clever, material effect, an epiphenomenon that's somehow just floating on the machine. And when we took that worldview, then all of a sudden the life went out of a lot of things.
Mm.
And, now we see, even though maybe on a wildlife level, we understand the bear and the puma and the eagle, Maybe we understand their habitat and their genetics and their, propensities to certain behaviors, but we've lost a whole aspect, a whole dimension of meaning from having stepped out of nature and it being forced to step back to it. And that is that these are not just individual animals, they are a major expression of nature and a major expression of specific natures that inform and form partnerships with humans in the natural world. So, like, there's a whole dimension to that. Like, bear is a. Am I? Am I back?
Yeah, you said bear is a thing, I think.
Yeah, in other words, it's not just an animal in the zoo. There is a spiritual energy that manifests in the world of nature as bear. And the same is the case, of course, with all the animals. And it's not this isn't when we say that, oh, these are just things that happen through evolution. It's like you're trying to make them into machines. Well, they're not machines. There's mind to them. They exist in a dimension of meaning as well as things that we can measure and describe the color of. It's not just a natural science. There's something more that goes on that involves spiritual science.
Mm.
And that is that we live in, and maybe some people say, well, this is panpsychism, or maybe more accurately, panentheism, which is to say that God manifests through all of creation. It's a little more complicated than that, but it says that these things are not just the random results of billiard balls, they're expressions of the mind of creator. So that's very different. And when you understand nature that way, you have a place in it. When you don't, when your metaphysics are wrong, you start even doubting whether you have free will. So, and again, these are really metaphysical issues that vibrate all the way up. These are the peas under the mattress that can be felt 13 mattresses up because they set the stage for all the play that goes on in front of them somehow, right? And they set the context for behavior, for what we do, for moral understandings of what is good and what is correct and all that stuff.
Yeah, it reminds me of a conversation we had, I think maybe a couple of episodes back, about the utility of image in addition to concept.
Right.
And now there's like a new dimension being added to that of kind of this authentic relationship to place, but also authentic relationship to nature that's beyond image, but is now manifest expression. Right.
Personality almost.
Yeah, you said personality of nature, and I think that's an interesting phrase.
Yeah. No, I think uh, for example, the way that animals exist in our unconscious or in our dream world is a pretty interesting expression of that. The way that they exist in the dimension of mind, as I said, and maybe there's more to unfold in that.
I had one dream. I had a
Mhm.
dream once in which I awoke thinking about the word and plant mangrove, with
Interesting.
which I'm not aware of having had any prior relationship. And I started researching why mangrove. And it's a plant that lives on the border between sea and land.
Right.
And sea representing emotions and land representing kind of ego structure. The border between that, understanding it, it preserves, it prevents erosion, it does all this stuff.
Mhm.
Gave all of this symbol to the rest of the dream that I
It
completely.
stabilizes the boundary there between those worlds, doesn't it?
And I had to research it post hoc to figure out what that was all about. It's not like I went into the dream thinking this is what mangroves do in nature and this is what they represent.
Right,
I
right.
I'm not from Florida. I don't know what a
right?
mangrove is.
Well, and you also bring in elemental energies, as in water is different in the dream world, in the world of mind and meaning, than it is in the chemistry lab where we understand that it's H2O.
Yeah.
Water takes on all sorts of things. You know, the Chinese in the I Ching, it's called the abysmal. We don't know what's down there, but we know
Yeah.
you can drown. You know, and so it starts to take on a personality, an energy, an energetic, and that the world that we see isn't just made up of elements like the periodic chart of the elements. It's also made up of energetic structures that live out through those elements, and that's how it all happens. That's why we have tiger. That's why we have bear. That's why, and so then a martial art like Shingi that has a particular expression for bear, a particular expression for eagle, particular expression for tiger and dragon, they become whole-brained ways to explore those energies
Mm.
as opposed to conceptual ways, right? So yeah, no, there's a lot there, and a lot of it's considered mysterious because it does go out of the clearly logical, rational, and it starts to work in the world of associations. Kind of like Finnegan's Wake, when people say it's a dream world, Ulysses is the daytime novel, Finnegan's Wake is the nighttime novel, and that's why there's restarts and things take double entendres, and all of a sudden there's inexplicable things that happen from the logic of daylight. And the same thing here, we start as we talked about a little with the I Ching and the way images start to work. They start to speak in these other ways that kind of move through time in a different way than perfectly languaged concepts do. Um,
Makes me curious if maybe we should do a little dream interpretation on an episode at some point, and maybe one of our listeners even wants to send in a dream for us to play
mhm,
around with. That'd be fun.
mhm. Yeah. Well, it's interesting. Then the other thing that's kind of been fun lately is, maybe about a year ago, I started having a much more frequency of lucid dreams.
Oh, huh.
Where I was in the dream and I knew I was in the dream, and in some cases, I would tell the people that I was in the dream, and in some of the last ones, I'm telling the people in the dream that I'm in a dream, and look, here's how, and I start levitating things off the table because you can just do stuff once you realize you're in a dream, and, like, I haven't I'm still plumbing the possibilities in that, but I do remember Jorge, the maestro, curandero down in South America. He said that when he had finally got to the top of his game, he would be able to work on patients in his sleep when he was dreaming through dreams. So yeah, there's a lot of interesting implications about that. And Freud did a lot of his early work was on interpretation of dreams. And while he got mined out a lot of information, he didn't get a lot of cures. So he ultimately left that as a pathway and ended up with resistance therapy, which we might have talked about before, but
Yeah.
yeah.
Cool. Well, maybe that's a place to put a pin.
Yeah,
It was interesting.
yeah, we touched on a lot of interesting places there, from the dog conversation.
Yeah. Cool. Good to see you, Brian. Thank you.
Good to see you also, sir, and, good day to everybody out there. Stick with us, a lot of cool guests coming up. And also, we're working our way to 1,000,000 subscribers, so, help us out. That's what I see everybody saying on YouTube, so it's like, I figured, "Hey, you might as well."
Why not? What's the number? Yeah.
We got our first tens of subscribers, so
Yeah.
it's any day now.
Yeah. Yeah. A tree on a mountain. Yep.
Exactly. Cool.